Thank you. Okay, so I'm here today to talk a little bit about round goby in Hamilton Harbour. Just as a quick intro to me, my name is Adrienne McLean. I'm a senior PhD candidate in the Aquatic Behavioral Ecology Lab at McMaster University. I also work work full-time for DFO. I'm a part-time student with McMaster, work full-time for Department of Fisheries and Oceans. But I'm here to talk about the work that I've done with McMaster in the lab and the work that our lab has done over a number of years. So to start out, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about round goby. So if we can go to the next slide. So what is a round goby? Well, it's a relatively small fish. You can hold it in your hand. It's got a great big mouth on it. It will eat anything it can fit in that mouth. Sorry, just got distracted by the question. But and it's got these big frog eyes on the top of its head that you can see they kind of sit up elevated above its head. It's an aquatic invasive species. We got a nice intro on what an invasive species is. Aquatic invasive species meaning, well, it's in the water. And it has a very aggressive behavior. They're very aggressive towards other round goby. They're very aggressive towards other species. They also can reproduce more than once in a year. So over their season, their reproductive season, which is spring into summer, they can have more than one round of reproduction. And as we saw from one of the earlier slides, a high reproductive rate can be one of the things that facilitates species invasion. So between their aggression and their high reproductive rate, these are things that are thought to make them very successful invaders, which they are. And by successful, I mean they cover a wide geographical range. They're not just invasive in North America or here in the harbor. And they tend to be in really high numbers in the habitats that they invade. They do really well in these environments that they invade in. Next slide. So where do they come from? Well, they come from the Black and Caspian Seas, which are in Eastern Europe. And if we just go to the next slide, they came into the Great Lakes through ship ballast water, through multiple release events of ship ballast water. And they were first found in the Great Lakes in the early 90s, first found in the harbor in 1999. Can we go to the next slide? So what are their impacts? Well, first, they live on the bottom and they eat things that are on the bottom. And one of those things are the eggs of native fish species. And that includes our sport fish, and it does include some species at risk. So they eat those eggs and they can eat a large number. One goby can eat a large number of eggs. And again, they tend to be in high densities, so they can clean out a nest pretty quickly. They also compete with our native fish species that occupy a similar niche. So they also live on the bottom, maybe live in similar habitats, eat similar things. And so we just see an example there on the bottom left of a cute little fish that's a log perch. So they've been found to displace log perch, which is a native species, but not just these species, they've been found to displace others. And in part that's because of this high aggressive behavior, their high reproductive rate, and their behavior of defending territories once they end up in them. One of the other things they do, and this can be, in a way, might be seen as a good thing, but there's some caveats, is that our native predatory species have come to identify them as a food source. Again, sounds great, right? But the caveat with this is that goby live on the bottom, which tends to be where, if you're in a contaminated environment, tends to be where contaminants are concentrated. They filter down and are concentrated typically in the sediment. Goby, that's where goby spend their time. But also because they eat zebra mussels and they eat things that are on the bottom. And it might sound great that they eat zebra mussels, another aquatic invasive species, but zebra mussels, they filter feed, they filter things out of the water. And so they tend to accumulate contaminants. So then they get eaten by a round goby, and then maybe our predatory fish eats them. They can be a vector of contaminants up that food chain. And finally, they tend to just be in really, really high numbers in the habitats that they invade. And so, for example, in the harbor, along the shoreline during the times that we're sampling it, they're like over 90% of what we catch. They tend to just be really high densities. Next slide. So what does ABLE, the Aquatic Behavioral Ecology Lab, what do we do? We do a number of things, but one of the things we do is monitor round goby in the Hamilton Harbour. And we've been doing this for 20 years, so since 2002. And like I mentioned, the goby were first found in the harbor in 99. So it's since shortly after their first invasion. And we sample them in a standardized way. We sample them in a number of other spots, but over the last 20 years, we've been sampling them in these 6 spots within the harbor using the same standardized gear, so we can get an idea of how their population is changing over time in the harbor. And so we've got 4 what we consider clean sites, have relatively low levels of contaminants. Those are our blue sites, and then 2 sites of very high contamination. Can we go to the next slide? Which are associated with Randall Reef and Windermere Arm, 2 of the most contaminated areas in North America. And so we go out here, it works, you can go to the next slide. We sample them in standardized ways to collect those data over 20 years, but we also do other stuff. So to facilitate what we learn through the population monitoring, we also go out and collect information. We set traps, we seine, we electrofish. Seining is pulling a net. You can see our team of volunteers or our students actually doing it there. We go out and do night sampling because they're most active during dawn and dusk. So we'll go out at night and collect them. We collect information on their behavior, on their migration patterns, on their life history. And again, for that information in the harbor, we're collecting information on the numbers, the sexes, the size, their reproductive investment, their condition, their energy reserves and energy investments. And we've been collecting this information to try to understand how the population has changed over the years in the harbor. Next slide. So what have we learned? Well, first off, I think I've already given a spoiler, but we've learned that we catch a lot of brown goby in the harbor. It is for this shore sampling that we do, it's the majority of what we catch with these standardized fishing methods are round goby. But we've also learned over the years that their numbers got really high, hit a peak, and then began to decline. Can we move to the next slide? So as they declined, we've seen that they've kind of come to a plateau. And this is true for both our contaminated sites and our clean sites. So they're in equal numbers at our contaminated sites, which is kind of interesting. It shows that they can persist in these contaminated environments, these very contaminated environments. Next slide. We've also learned that goby at the contaminated environments are a lot smaller than those at our uncontaminated environments. And they have higher reproductive investment relative to their body size. So bigger gonads for their size compared to the ones of the clean environments. We don't know why this is. It could be because they are, on average, the population is younger. You're younger, you're going to be smaller. Or it could be that they're the same age, but their growth is stunted for some reason. We're not sure. We have started to collect information on their age through otoliths, which is a bone in their head. You can age them, but we don't know the results of that yet. We've learned a number of other things, again, about their behavior and stuff, but in terms of the population in the harbor, these are the big ticket items that we've learned so far. Next slide. So why does this matter? Well, first, it gives us some information about how an invasive species of population has changed over time since shortly after they invaded, once they've established into the new habitat and their population has plateaued. So we can see how that has changed, but we can also see how that differs for when they're in different environmental stressors, when they're in a contaminated environment versus an uncontaminated environment, which gives us insights into how populations, invasive species populations, can change over time and across environments, and can help us understand management or control options. Next slide. And also, I talked about a little bit about this before, but it also tells us that round goby can persist in these contaminated environments. They were in equal numbers to our clean sites, and like I said, if they're living on the bottom in a contaminated site, they can accumulate those contaminants. They can eat things that accumulate those contaminants, and then they can be eaten by our predatory fish species, by shorebirds, by things like that. And so they can be that vector of transfer of contaminants up the food chain because they're living and persisting in these contaminated environments. Next slide. So what can you do? One of the things that I was asked to do when I was asked to present here was to talk about, what can the general public do with regards to invasive species? And one of the things is to be able to identify them. There's There's lots of good information on the internet. There's fish ID keys, fish field books, and things like that. But if you're spending time in and around the water, it can be useful to be able to identify what they look like. We have some native species that might look similar to round gobies, so it might be good to know the differences. If you like to fish, don't dump your bait bucket into the water body that you're fishing in, because you could have, that's one of the ways we think a lot of invasive species, aquatic invasive species, get spread. And if you have one in your bucket and you dump it into the environment you're fishing in, you can give it a new method of transportation. So, and that's thought to be one of the ways round goby are beyond our Great Lakes and our inland lakes are being spread. So don't dump your bait bucket into the water. Follow the practices of the area that you're in, the best practices from whether it's provincial body or if you're fishing in the States, like a state or something like that, follow their regulations in terms of handling your leftover bait. If you're fishing, don't fish with them. Don't use them as bait. Don't transport aquatic invasive species. If you see somebody transporting them, you can always report it to what used to be the Ministry of Natural Resources, is now the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry, but I did put their number up there. If you see one, you can call the toll-free invading species hotline, or you can go onto inaturalist.org and report it. But I will just say that we know that they're in the Great Lakes and they're in high numbers. But if you see them in those inland lakes, that could be useful. Other things that you can do, there's sometimes volunteer opportunities with organizations. For example, Trout Unlimited might be doing a restoration project where they're going to restore a shoreline from a hardened, unnatural shoreline to something more natural, which might be better for the native species, whereas something like goby might really like that hardened shoreline. That's one way members of the public can get involved. And even our own lab, we sometimes look for volunteers, typically for university students, and occasionally we've taken on some high school students to give them that training as well. But we do these big sampling events, and we occasionally will take on volunteers. So I'd say if you're interested in that kind of thing, keep your eye out, keep your ear to the ground, and it's usually posted online so you can look for things like that. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, for that. That was definitely interesting to know that they can still thrive in an area, just like still thrive in an area that's contaminated just as well as in an area that's not. Like that's concerning.
Yeah, yep.
But we're going to hand over the discussion now to Christine Boston. I know we had said that there would be a pre-recording. I don't know if you want us to share that or if you would like to go ahead with your presentation, but just let us know.
Hi, I did pre-record it and I did share it with you. So if you did want to go ahead and play it, that would be great. Otherwise, I can try and do it from my end as well. Oops, sorry, I should put my video on. And it's about 20 minutes long, so you might want to grab a drink or something.
I'm good to begin if you are.
Okay. I can't hear anything.
1 second.
Thank you for inviting me to speak about invasive species this evening. I'm an aquatic research biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, otherwise known as DFO, which is a federal government department. I've been with the department for 23 years and I've been doing research and monitoring projects in Hamilton Harbour since 2002. I am very interested in invasive species as they are, along with habitat loss, the biggest threats to freshwater native biodiversity. During the last 5 years or so, I've been involved in some goldfish-specific research projects, both in Hamilton Harbour proper and the watershed, and I'm going to be sharing some of those results with you this evening. The objectives of my presentation tonight are to define aquatic invasive species, or AIS, from the department's perspective, and to tell you a bit about how we manage invasive species at DFO. Typically, we manage invasives through their pathways like ballast water or commercial bait, for example, or by species like the sea lamprey or a group of species like the Asian carp, of which there are 4. There is also a list of prohibited species in Canada by province. I'm also going to talk about invasive species in Hamilton Harbour and how I got interested in goldfish, which led to the stormwater management pond project that I'm working on right now, and touch on about what you can do to help prevent and stop the spread of invasive species. What is an AIS, an aquatic invasive species? These species are fish, invertebrates, or plants that have been introduced into a new aquatic environment outside of their natural range. These species have harmful effects on the receiving water bodies and their ecosystems. An invasive species can be from another country or continent, or from a different part of the country. For example, Asian carp are from Asia and would be considered non-native across the country, but smallmouth bass, which are native to Ontario, can be invasive in New Brunswick or Manitoba. Some species are on the department's list and others are not. Whether you are on the list or not guides management, response, and regulations. If a species is on the federal list, such as the 4 species of Asian carp, the sale of such is prohibited, and the detection of one of these carp would elicit an eradication response. If a species is not on the list, it doesn't mean it is not invasive, but it dictates how we can currently manage them, and hopefully with more information, the list will grow with species additions over time. How do invasive species get here? They have multiple ways of getting into our natural systems through what we call pathways. Some of the major pathways includes canals, ballast water from ships, that's how zebra mussels and the brown gobies got here, the live bait trade. An example of species that got in through the live bait trade is rudd, Eurasian rudd, which is in Hamilton Harbour, or through the live organism trade, which includes the aquarium, water garden, and live food trade. There has been a lot of research that has been done over the years by both the federal and provincial departments that has resulted in very recent new regulations to prevent the introduction and spread of invasives through ballast water and the fishing bait industry. As I mentioned, at DFO, we try to manage invasive species through pathways, or in some cases by species or a species-specific group. We have a whole department that manages sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, and without them, our salmonines or salmonids wouldn't exist. Sea lamprey belong to a primitive class of jawless fish that have existed for 300 million years. There are approximately 40 species of lamprey in the world, of which the sea lamprey is the largest. These are what sea lamprey wounds would look like on a salmonid species. Sea lamprey were first observed in Lake Ontario in 1835, although their origin there remains uncertain. They were blocked from the remaining Great Lakes by Niagara Falls, but with improvements to the Welland Canal during the early 1900s, they gained entry to Lake Erie. By 1938, they were present in all 5 of the Great Lakes. After sea lampreys invaded all of the Great Lakes, the impact was profound. Lake trout were hit especially hard. The once thriving commercial fishery was gone, and the lake trout were largely extirpated in much of the Great Lakes, and extirpated means locally extinct. This graph shows the impact on the lake trout commercial harvest following the invasion of sea lamprey into each of the Great Lakes. The impact was immediate and brutal. This top predator and prized native species was decimated. A similar story can be told about other key species in the basin. Any other type of salmon, trout, or whitefish are particularly susceptible to sea lamprey parasitism. Lake Ontario is the Great Lake most impacted by invasive species, and Hamilton Harbour is connected to Lake Ontario. There are 7 important invasive species that are present in Hamilton Harbour, and I'm just talking about fish here. Some of the original invaders in Lake Ontario, and hence Hamilton Harbour, came through the building of the Erie and Welland Canal systems. We just talked about sea lamprey, but also included alewife and white perch. Alewife are one of the top prey fish for Lake Ontario predatory fishes, but they cause problems with something called thymidase that affects their ability to reproduce viable offspring. Lake trout in Lake Ontario is a classic example of a species that has experienced recruitment failure as a result of their alewife-dominated diet. Common carp were originally brought to North America as a food source to surprisingly replace declining salmon stocks and escape from a pond during a flooding event to Lake Ontario. Goldfish, which are one of the species I'm keenly interested in, are released from the live fish trade, and rudd are thought to have come in through the bait fish trade prior to more stringent regulations. We first saw them sporadically in Hamilton Harbour in 2006, and now they are very abundant alongside goldfish and carp. And just as a side note, goldfish, common carp, and rudd all belong to the same family, Cyprinidae. The round goby followed the zebra mussels via ballast water introductions and has changed the whole structure of the Great Lakes food webs where they exist. In Hamilton Harbour, common carp are an actively managed species. By 1950, the historical fishery in Hamilton Harbour was gone due to a number of factors, and the new fishery was a mix of small, short-lived pelagic species and generalists like common carp. The fish community was out of balance, with not enough top predators to control these other species. By the 1950s, common carp had become well established and flourished. They have a very destructive way of feeding that stirs up the sediment and makes the water too turbid for plants to grow. In a healthy system with a balanced fish community, these types of species can be controlled. In 1996, the two-way fishway was constructed at the entrance to Cootes Paradise, which is an important wetland for Hamilton Harbour fishes, providing important spawning and nursery habitat for native species like northern pike and yellow perch, and was designed to prevent mature common carp from entering the marsh. The carp barrier is actively managed during the open water season from March to November by the Royal Botanical Gardens. In addition to the large manually operated barrier at Cootes Paradise, there are also several passive carp barriers at the entrance to Grindstone Creek ponds, which are also important spawning and nursery habitat for native fishes. The Royal Botanical Gardens also actively removes carp, goldfish, and Eurasian rudd from both Cootes and Grindstone Creek ponds when possible. Common carp management in Hamilton Harbour has been very successful in reducing the population to about 20% of what it was back in 1988, when DFO started monitoring fish populations in the harbour. It was this trend in carp and goldfish numbers in the harbour that piqued my initial interest in goldfish. This figure is looking at the mean number of fishes per transect over time. So this is from our boat electrofishing surveys. We know that goldfish were in the harbour in the late 1970s, and there was a massive die-off of goldfish in Hamilton Harbour that was attributed to reproductive failure associated with industrial contamination. Goldfish were rarely captured, so like less than 0.02 individuals per transit in the harbour during routine fish community surveys between 1988 and 2002, until the mid-2000s when we started to see an increase in numbers observed alongside this decline in common carp. While the average catch of carp remains low today, goldfish are still regularly being captured and are quite abundant in many parts of the harbour. What I have discovered is that despite being globally invasive, there is actually very little known about goldfish ecology in the wild. We know that they are destructive and voracious feeders like carp and very tolerant of low dissolved oxygen and temperature extremes and can outcompete our native fishes, but we don't know much about their actual ecology. So we took advantage of the telemetry network in Hamilton Harbour and surgically implanted tags into 10 large adult goldfish so we could track them 24/7. And these are the tags that we put into the fish. They're about the size of a AA battery. What is telemetry? It is remote tracking, and it is our underwater listening system that allows us to learn about what our fish are doing 365 days a year. The Hamilton Harbour array is made up of 58 receivers, which are all the dots on this figure. And when one of our tagged fishes is in the vicinity of one of these receivers, it picks up the signal and it is recorded so we know where they are. We also know what depth they are based on the special tags that we used. A picture of a receiver can be seen on the left-hand side of this slide, and they are placed strategically throughout the harbour. So what are goldfish doing in the harbour? What we found out is that goldfish love Hamilton Harbour so much that they never leave. They spend most of their time in the west end of the harbour, but some individuals are more adventurous and hang out in other areas like the east end or the north shore until it gets cold in the late fall, and they head back to the west end to overwinter between 2.5 and 6.5 meters of water. In the late winter, around the middle of April, this is based on temperature, not calendar days, when the water temperatures reach about 11 degrees Celsius, our goldfish were detected at the entrance to Cootes Paradise Fishway or at other identified spawning sites in the Grindstone Creek system. much earlier, and this was much earlier than we would expect them to spawn. They are also in very shallow water at this time, less than 1.5 meters. They are shallow and aggregated but not ready to spawn because the water temperatures are too cold for their babies to grow, so we think we have identified a pre-spawn staging movement. This would be a good time to remove them before they start reproducing. None of our large tag goldfish were detected in Coote's Paradise, but that doesn't mean that smaller individuals were not able to get in through the bars designed to keep out adult carp. Goldfish become sexually mature at a much smaller size than adult carp and are a much smaller species. There are signs that goldfish are becoming more abundant in the wild. Over the past decade, they have become more prominent in Hamilton Harbour and Lake Erie, in addition to inhabiting stormwater ponds and conservation areas across southern Ontario. Just Google goldfish and storm ponds and you will see that they are becoming more prevalent across our country, and in fact, it was the media attention to the goldfish issue in Hamilton Harbour that connected myself with the City of Hamilton. The drainage superintendent of the City of Hamilton is an avid angler and sent me a message saying that he thought that the stormwater management ponds that the city manages may be contributing to our goldfish problem in the harbour. Why are we concerned about stormwater management ponds and their fishes? For starters, they're not supposed to have fish, but they find their way into these ponds. The goldfish in these photos are from 3 different ponds managed by the City of Hamilton. Stormwater ponds are naturalized areas connected to sewer systems and watercourses that ultimately drain into our rivers and lakes. The role of the storm ponds are to remove sediment from the water and manage the volume of water during storm events. During storm events, these ponds connect to natural waterways and are likely contributing to introductions of invasive species across the country, like goldfish and Prussian carp. The Prussian carp is another species of goldfish that has made its way into rivers and lakes in Alberta and Saskatchewan and is believed to have been introduced into the wild through storm ponds. Not only can invasive fish be finding a home in these ponds and contributing to introductions into our native waters, but they can also affect the water quality in the ponds by disturbing the sediment like carp when they feed, which also has negative effects on the receiving watercourse or water body and defeats the main purpose of these ponds. It is becoming more and more evident to me that stormwater management ponds are a vector for the live aquatic organism trade. This is not a Hamilton-specific problem, but it is a problem for Hamilton, as Hamilton is listed as an aquatic invasive species introduction hotspot for users of the live trade, and the aquarium and water garden trade is a growing industry, so we can expect the releases of unwanted organisms will increase in the future and continue to threat our local native biodiversity. Today, we have discovered that stormwater ponds are home to many species of fishes, including goldfish, and we are concerned that inputs from the watershed may be negating our control efforts in the harbor proper. Last year, the group that I work with at DFO started a project in Hamilton stormwater management ponds that will contribute to a risk assessment on stormwater ponds as a vector for aquatic invasive species from the live trade industry to natural waters, and that includes other species other than fishes, but also to a species-based risk assessment on goldfish, which currently is not listed as an invasive species federally, although it is recognized as invasive. These ponds are extreme environments, and the goldfish may be thriving in them because they can go for long periods of time, 4 to 5 months to be exact, without oxygen and can tolerate extreme environmental conditions. These are not the kind of species we want in our natural environment, especially in the face of climate change and loss of biodiversity when our native fishes are becoming stressed by warmer waters. In addition, degraded ecosystems like Hamilton Harbour are more vulnerable to invasive fishes or species because they don't have healthy populations of native species needed to control them. I do remain optimistic though and think that these ponds are a place we can do some good and provide more positive outcomes. Over 2 years, this project started last year, we are going to survey 30 stormwater management ponds across the City of Hamilton and identify factors that contribute to the arrival and potential dispersal of non-native species to Hamilton waters. We will identify high-risk ponds in the City of Hamilton and facilitate the removal of invasive fishes in the Hamilton watershed where possible. So having said all of that, I'm going to show you some of the things that we've been looking at with the storm ponds and show you some of the fish pictures from last year's sampling. The City of Hamilton manages about 70 wet ponds in 9 watersheds managed by 4 conservation authorities, and ponds eventually drain into Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Pond development started in 1985, and over the last 30 years, 56 ponds have been built. 86% of those ponds were built from 2000 to present day. These are the stormwater management pond locations in the city of Hamilton. The yellow circles are assumed storm ponds managed by the city and included in the study, and the red triangles are ponds yet to be assumed by the city. If you overlay all the new development in Hamilton Harbour since 2001, it will basically be in the same locations as most of these ponds. The largest portion of ponds managed by the city of Hamilton drain into Hamilton Harbour or Lake Ontario directly. 51% of Hamilton ponds drain directly into Hamilton Harbour. The Red Hill Creek system is the largest receiver of the Hamilton storm ponds, followed by the Spencer Creek system that flows into Cootes Paradise, and then Grindstone Creek, found in many of the new developments in Waterdown. These are the factors that we are looking at that can contribute to introduction and spread, and we will be sampling a range of sites within these variables. For example, for AIS introduction, we think that distance to the nearest road edge or pathway may be important contributors to introduction. In Hamilton, 80% of the ponds are less than 50 meters away from a road, and 62% are less than 20 meters away from a pathway. In terms of spread of invasive species, most storm ponds are less than 100 meters away from the nearest watercourse, that's a stream or a creek, and a large percentage connect directly to a watercourse or stream, or to the receiving watercourse via storm sewer. Pond 104 was one of the ponds we worked in last year that was drained for sediment maintenance by the City of Hamilton and Stony Creek, and it was very close to Lake Ontario, connected by a storm sewer. We moved about 18.5 thousand goldfish from that pond. Pond 89 was another total goldfish pond that was drained for sediment maintenance last year. It was in Ancaster and connected to another stormwater pond that connected to Big Creek via storm sewer, which is part of the Grand River system. We removed approximately 18,000 goldfish from that pond. To look at this pond, you would not know that there were so many fish because it was so turbid. And we captured so many different kinds of goldfish, including black googly-eyed ones called blackmore goldfish. Pond 124 is a pond in Ancaster where we captured monster goldfish and many other interesting native species. We captured 8 species in this pond. This pond was much deeper than the other ponds we sampled and had a nice largemouth bass population, which were probably able to survive over the winter because of the deeper water. We didn't see any tiny goldfish, so the bass might be keeping the goldfish population in this pond in check. This year we will be sampling about 25 ponds in the Hamilton Harbour watershed, including this large pond complex behind the Walmart in Waterdown, which is chock full of goldfish and drains into the Grindstone Creek. The City of Hamilton will be draining this pond for maintenance, and all fishes will be removed. While it isn't close to any houses, the trail system around the pond is well utilized. What can you do to help? Contact us to report an invasive species. This program is managed by the provincial government, and if you go to their website, there's lots of great tips on what to do if you discover an invasive species. There's a number to call, etc. And it also talks about a lot of the new regulations. If you see someone introducing something into a pond or a stream, for example, or to Hamilton Harbour, report it. It's a legal activity. Probably the most important of all is to be responsible pet owners, boaters, and anglers. Never release unwanted pets into the environment. It is illegal, and most pet stores will take back unwanted pets or will help you rehome them. So this was, these are some of the goldfish that I took pictures at the PetSmart in Ancaster. And the picture on the far right-hand side is a stormwater pond in Waterdown. And I was walking around the edge of it last spring, and I saw this blue aquarium gravel, which made me think that somebody released their pet goldfish or turtle or something into this pond. Again, like I said, be responsible boaters, watercraft. As of January 1st, 2022, there's new regulations that any type of watercraft must follow to help prevent the spread of invasive species from water body to water body. And there's also very stringent new regulations for bait, which is amazing. So have a look at that if you're an angler. And be aware, be vigilant. If you're a pet owner, a naturalist, an angler, a concerned citizen, get to know what invasive species are out there, existing and new. The tench is, for an example, an invader coming our way from the St. Lawrence system. So be aware of what's out there. And as always, no program or project happens without a team or partners. And a huge thank you to the City of Hamilton and the Universities of Windsor and Toronto for partnering on the stormwater management project with us. Thank you for your time, and I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Christine. The size of those goldfish, concerning, but I definitely feel as though I might be able to relate to them a little bit, just in the fact that I can never leave Hamilton. Like, we're just one and the same. Like, I can't do it. Thank you, though.
I do, to be honest, I find 20,000 little goldfish more disturbing than those big ones, because they can get in, you know, there's a big rain event and they can easily pass through probably the outlets to get into the, you know, the nearest water course that might go into the harbor. But yeah, they were pretty crazy, some of those fish.
Yeah, actually, we're going to hand it over to Megan just to talk about carp in Windermere. But yeah, let's hear from Megan.
Okay, maybe someone can just let me know if you can, in fact, see that presentation. Awesome. So as introduced, my name is Megan Lloyst. I'm an aquatic ecologist, and I work as a technical discipline manager for ecology for our national ecology team with SLR Consulting. So we're an environmental consulting firm. I've got over 10 years of experience working as an aquatic ecologist, both in the private consulting sector and also in academia and government agency sectors. Primarily, I specialize in the characterization and assessment of stream, lake, large river, and fish and benthic macroinvertebrate communities, as well as aquatic habitat. I typically identify potential impacts to these systems as a result of predicted ecosystem responses, largely related to land use, and then I develop mitigation and offset strategies. And today I am here and I am going to discuss some invasive species management programs that we've implemented in Windermere wetland. So just to give you a quick overview of today's presentation, I'm going to give an introduction to Windermere wetland. For those of you who aren't familiar with this habitat, I'm going to discuss the restoration and monitoring activities implemented within the wetland, discuss some adaptive management techniques that we've applied to help mitigate invasive species concerns, and introduce some very newly emerging studies which focus on more of an innovative approach to manage invasive species in Windermere wetland. And then, of course, I'll end the presentation with a few discussion points related to future considerations. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Windermere wetland, it's located right at the southeast corner of Hamilton Harbour and at the mouth of Red Hill Creek. This area is significantly industrialized, and that's occurred after over about the last half a century. And the marshlands within this area have largely disappeared over the past half century. In 1990, the basin, Windermere Basin, which is illustrated in this figure, was actually reconstructed as a sediment trap. So basically, it was used to reduce and or help eliminate any sediment that was transporting from Red Hill Creek into Hamilton Harbour. And the sediments within the basin were recognized to be fairly contaminated, high total phosphorus, copper, iron, and zinc. To name a few. So this is a picture of Windermere Basin, and this was sort of pre-construction activities. So this was when it was functioning as a sediment trap. And the next image from a similar, sorry, I'll get to that. The next image is showing some of the equipment that was used when the basin was transformed into a wetland. So that happened in about 2001. A Windermere Steering Committee was established, and that committee was established to really facilitate the restoration of that basin or sediment trap. And in 2007, a municipal class EA environmental assessment was completed, and remediation and restoration activities were initiated in the basin or sediment trap in 2010. So in order to facilitate these activities, the wetland was actually dewatered and dredged, and portions of the wetland were capped with like a woven geotextile fabric to ensure that any residual contaminants within the sediment wouldn't resurface in the future. And the restoration activities involved closing off the basin from Red Hill Creek with what you can see in this image, a constructed berm. And that berm was really what was used to form the future wetland, formerly known as Windermere Basin and or the sediment trap. And then ultimately, Windermere wetland was designed to include various habitat components, as you can see in this image. And some of these habitat components included tern islands, these fingerlings around the edge of the wetland to create various littoral zones, deeper pools within the wetland, and a fishway that you can see right on the edge with Red Hill Creek. And this image just illustrates the wetland under a higher water level with a significant amount of vegetation established around the riparian zone and some on the tern islands. So I had mentioned fishway. As part of the restoration activities, project engineers and biologists work collaboratively to design a fishway that would effectively facilitate multi-species passage from Red Hill Creek into Windermere wetland. And it's important to note that the water levels within the wetland are actually manipulated through a series of pumps constructed as part of the wetland restoration program. So water is actively pumped from Red Hill Creek into the wetland to facilitate the operation of this fishway. So you can see the water flowing under various conditions in this slide. And we can plan for water levels to be high during spring, when typically fish migrate into the wetland for spawning. And we can plan for lower water levels in the summer to help promote vegetation establishment. And then in the fall, we can plan again for higher water levels so that fish are able to migrate from the wetland out into Red Hill Creek and potentially the harbor for overwintering. And from the images, you can just see that the fishway was designed to include features like riffle pool configuration so that fish had, areas of fast flowing water and resting areas. And the materials were arranged to form this V-crest cross section to concentrate water flow in the center of the fishway, again promoting the movement of fish, and a range of stone sizes were applied to reduce any type of intergravel flow and create, again, that variation in velocity and refuge areas for fish. And then you can also see from some of the images, and you'll see it a bit more on the next slide, but there's also an adjustable stop log structure that was placed at the upstream end of the fishway. And again, this was established to allow some finer adjustments to water level elevations within the wetland. So I'll just flip to the next, and there you can see a pretty good top view of the fishway. And the way that the fishway was designed was that modifications could be enacted as required. So in the past, we recognized that the attractive flow velocity at the downstream end of the fishway needed some modification. So further down in the fishway, bags were filled with some pea gravel, were placed to create that variable flow and attractive conditions for fish. Now, a really important component of the fishway was that given the local presence of common carp, the fishway was designed with a fish grate to help limit the movement of common carp from Red Hill Creek into the wetland, their preferred spawning habitat. So the grate spacings were established to prevent the movement of adult carp. Now again, this does not inhibit the movement of smaller individuals that may still be able to access the wetland through that grate spacing. And we've heard a bit about common carp already in the other presentations, but just as a reminder, carp can have detrimental impacts to aquatic habitats, particularly establishing wetlands. So their feeding behavior can damage rooted vegetation, which obviously increases turbidity and may even suppress the growth of macrophytes. They do prey on macroinvertebrates, which may indirectly impact food supply for other native fish. And I like this diagram. Again, it's from a published journal article, but it just really nicely depicts some of those indirect versus direct impacts from carp on the aquatic food web. So we developed a wetland, both a wetland and fishery monitoring program in 2015. And the objectives of this program was to operate the fishway during appropriate timing windows for species known to occur within Red Hill Creek, collect fish from both the fishway and the wetland while the fishway was in operation, and use this information to help develop some operational guidelines and protocols for the fishway and water level management for Windermere wetland. So we used spike nets, a passive and non-lethal sampling method. And you can see a picture of a spike net on this slide and how it was set with two sort of wings out to the side and then one lead down the middle. And these are typically used within the littoral zone habitats. Each fish collection event followed the format in which the nets were set one day and then pulled the next day after approximately 24 hours. And on May 18th, 2018, we identified approximately 25 common carp congregating within the shallow regions of the wetland. Prior to this, there was no indication or observation of common carp in the wetland, at least through the snapshots of monitoring activities that we were doing. And this timing coincides with common carp spawning window, and that thrashing behavior that we observed was very consistent with their typical spawning behavior. And that was done within those flooded vegetated areas. So we quickly reacted to the situation and we implemented a two-approach system in an attempt to remove as many carp as possible from Windermere wetland. Our first approach was a manual removal. So the capture of carp was targeted during, again, the spawning window. And while carp were still congregating in the shallow regions of the wetland, we attempted to go in and use nets of various types to trap and direct the carp towards the shore for removal. Ultimately, the carp became very dispersed, and this approach proved to be ineffective. Therefore, we mobilized a raft electrofisher, which you can see on the pictures within this slide, to assist with the removal program. And again, for those that perhaps have not had the pleasure of electrofishing, this is a technique which introduces a direct current into the water, which in turn affects the movement of fish, pulls them into the area being fished, temporarily stuns those fish, but does not impact or cause permanent damage to the fish in most cases. So we implemented this approach again in the spring spawning window when carp were known to congregate together. We electrofished the wetland using a transect approach and moving towards the shore. And this approach used that electrical current to help push the fish towards the shore and increase the likelihood of capture. Now, for this method, we were able to draw down the wetland in order to reduce the overall area in which the carp could potentially disperse. And this method proved to be effective for the most part. And we implemented that electrofishing removal approach from 2018 to 2021. And all carp captured during those removal activities were euthanized and buried, and any native bycatch was, of course, returned to the wetland. So this slide presents the carp capture results during the routine wetland monitoring events, both spring and fall, since the first known occurrence of carp in 2018. And the top panel presents a frequency distribution, the total length of captured carp, whereas the bottom panel presents the number of carp captured from 2018 to 2021. So in 2018, monitoring of the fish community indicated abundance of young of year and juvenile carp, whereas from 2019 to 2020, we really saw that abundant shift to large carp within the wetland, suggesting that spawning and successful carp reproduction and rearing of young had occurred in the wetland. In 2021, evidence changed in abundance back to young of year and juvenile carp, similar to those first observations made in 2018 was noted. And then again, most notable in 2021, although implementing this program, we observed an elevated number of carp captured, which equated to over 600. Those, of course, were all euthanized and removed from the wetlands. When we look at the data for catch results during the targeted carp removal activities since the known occurrence in 2018, we see the results presented on this slide. And these fish, again, were also euthanized following capture. Similar to the last slide, that top panel presents a frequency distribution of total length of captured carp, and the bottom panel represents the number of carp captured from 2018 to 2021. From 2018 to 2019, carp removal activities did indicate an increase in abundance of large carp. And then in 2020, 2021, we noted an elevated number of carp captured and a change in the abundance to young of year and juvenile carp. So although the removal of carp through the electrofishing technique had proven to be somewhat effective, the technique required significant effort and year after year costs. The removal efforts typically include mobilizing 4+ ecologists to the site for up to 2 days, plus the use of electrofishing equipment. And from 2018 to 2021, we experienced, common issues with field programs such as failure in equipment, the delay of onset of the scheduled removal activities. And as we all know, the timing is critical for the successful removal of adult carp. And the timing can be challenging to successfully meet with removal attempts. Electrofishing is also weather dependent, so precipitation and wind can largely influence the effectiveness of electrofishing efforts. And the redispersion of carp in the wetland has lowered our success in catch during those targeted removal activities. And electrofishing methods do not guarantee the removal of all carp or the prevention of carp from entering the wetland. So our team was really interested in exploring the application of a different approach or technique to support invasive species management program within Windermere wetland. And I should note, carp was definitely the species targeted within the removal program, but we did have evidence of other species such as rudd for the most part, and goldfish, and then just a few round gobies that of course were also removed from the wetland. So at SLR, we have an internal research and innovation program, and we applied for funding to support our curiosity as it relates to the invasive species monitoring program in Windermere wetland. And we were awarded funding in summer of 2021. And this initiative was, of course, was also supported through the City of Hamilton and also Resilient Consulting. So our team is now currently investigating the application of a carp tagging and tracking program, similar to the last presentation that we heard about, using an acoustic telemetry approach to locate fish for invasive species management and support future invasive species management techniques. And for this undertaking, we did collaborate with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to develop a study approach to collect data related to carp movements, habitat use, and reproductive sites within the wetland. And through this technique, we anticipate that acoustic telemetry will provide carp movement data to inform successful species removals. Will provide data regarding seasonal fish habitat associations that can help inform restoration plans. And through collaborating with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, additional acoustic telemetry data will be collected from the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. And this data will help further support the testing of our hypotheses. The efficiency of capture would potentially improve tracking and capturing tagged individuals. So on October 29th of last year, 2021, our team were in the field with DFO in the City of Hamilton, and we surgically inserted several transmitters into captured carp and deployed a series of battery-powered receivers within the wetland and just outside of the wetland in Red Hill Creek. And on this slide, you can see pictures of the team surgically implanting the tags and then, of course, deploying some of those receivers. And after deploying the telemetry units into several large adult carp, as I mentioned, we returned back to the wetland, and that's when we deployed the receivers. So that was done immediately following the tagging event. And just to give a few more details, about 10 receivers were deployed by boat in the wetland, and then 3 in Red Hill Creek. And now we're at a situation where our project team is anxiously awaiting upcoming data download event and interpretation, and that will happen in spring of this year after ice out. And this data, of course, will be used to inform future invasive species management efforts within Windermere wetland. Future considerations. So we will continue the wetland monitoring program. The monitoring should continue in order to document timing, variability of use of the fishway, and of course, this emerging wetland fish community as the wetland continues to establish. And we will continue investigating invasive species management within the wetland. So as I mentioned, following ice out, our team will be there to download receiver data. We'll refine the carp removal program wherever possible. And we do have a carp removal program planned for 2022. And as part of the research and innovation funding, we also undertook efforts to collect environmental DNA samples from the wetland to inform the fish community composition within and near the wetland. The wetland certainly proved challenging. We've implemented eDNA studies in various habitats throughout Ontario and BC, but the high sediment and organic loads within Windermere wetland really presented a unique challenge to our standard laboratory processing procedure. So we hope to be interpreting these results in early spring as we continue to sort of mitigate some of those issues that we're having within the laboratory. And that's everything for today, guys. Thank you.